Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Solutions podcast. I'm here today with Jojo Mehta, who is the co-founder and executive director of Stop Ecocide. So we've known each other for many years, and we're just going to have a brief conversation to for those of you that don't know about the law of ecocide, to hear a little bit more about it and how our relationship kind of works together, my work, over 20 years with Ecocide on the ground. As you can see behind me, a river running black has been a reality for me working in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So I've been surrounded by Ecocide and the effects of it, of the people on the ground. And Jojo working with our dear friend Polly Higgins for many, many years, and has now kind of taken that baton and is leading the campaign for the law of Ecocide. So hi, Jojo, welcome.
Hi, Nicola, wonderful to be with you.
Yay. So tell us a little bit about, can you give, for those of us that don't know about Ecocide, a little bit of the background? Why is this law important?
Well, I think I probably should start the story with Polly, if that's all right with you. So Polly was a Scottish barrister who was just on the verge of sort of hitting the big time, you could say, in terms of the court cases she was taking on. And this was in the early 2000s. And she had a bit of a moment of revelation looking out over London from the Royal Courts of Justice and thinking, well, it's not just my clients that need protecting, it's actually the earth itself. And she embarked on a sort of a mission. And her question was, how do we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And that became really her life quest. She's no longer with us. She passed away in 2019. But she spent 15 years of her life dedicated to this question. And to begin with, she looked at the rights of nature. And she was involved in early discussions around the Universal Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth and the considerations in some of the South American countries around including rights of nature. But what she realized is that it's one side of a coin, and the other side is the criminal aspect. So you have the sort of rights law, which is in the civil arena, and then you have criminal law, and it is criminal law that protects those rights. So to put this in a very simple way, your right to life is protected by the fact that killing you is a crime. And so from that sort of concept, if you like, that vision, she moved towards the criminal law and realized that the international crimes that are currently in place didn't really cover serious harm to the environment. So international crimes, as we know them, are war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and more recently, the crime of aggression. And Polly's contention and what she worked for many years to promote was the concept of adding ecocide or mass destruction of nature to that list of international crimes. And that was then the mission that she had for the rest of her life. It was the mission that we had together when we co-founded the public campaign. And it's still the mission that Stop Ecocide International now pursues at the global level. And it's gaining huge momentum. It's very exciting at the moment.
It is very exciting. It's like actually getting in all this mainstream media, and it always feels very exciting seeing it actually really, really kind of getting out there. And this word, ecocide, and Polly was very much about name it, use the word. Let's really get it in the vocabulary. And that seems to be really happening.
It is, and it's also very important, and the word itself is important because it's got such a sort of potency. It has the sort of strength of a word like genocide. In other words, genocide describes the destruction of a people, and ecocide describes the destruction of nature. And so it has that kind of punch to it in terms of people's understanding of it. It's also important in the way that, I mean, there are many environmental laws in place, multilateral agreements, there's the Paris Agreement, there are other agreements around the environment. But for example, I mean, the UN is working on a legally binding treaty around transnational corporations and their effects on human rights and the environment. But that's a very long sentence to say. And when you talk about ecocide, it's just the one word. And people then have this sort of almost like a gut response as soon as they understand it. And it's like, well, that's wrong and that should stop. So there's something actually very powerful just in the word and the concept itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, kind of the witnessing of this massive contamination, this massive ecocide in the Amazon, which, it was 11 years ago last month that, this case, and we thought, that's it, it's over. Justice has been served. Chevron, who took over Texaco, were ordered to pay $9.5 billion to clean the mess up. And here we are 11 years later, and they still haven't paid. They still haven't cleaned the mess up. The rivers are still running black. There's still almost 1,000 toxic pits left in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And the indigenous people are the most affected. So we have these environmental laws, but they're obviously just not working. And again, we hear of these examples, how corporations seem to be above the law. I think that's what's really kind of important about this law.
I think absolutely that sort of puts a finger a bit on why criminal law in particular is so important. There was actually a study done, I think it was Colorado University, where they looked at the effect that you make when you change environmental regulation. And what they found was that it tended to change budgeting. In other words, corporations would simply adjust their budgets to accommodate perhaps more complaints, more court cases, and so on. But if you added a criminal law aspect to those changes, then you started to see changes in behavior. And I think that's what's so important about the idea of actually criminalizing ecocide, because and I think there's been some very important developments over the last year that have made this much more real for people. So last year, there was a legal definition of ecocide that was the result of our foundation convening a group of international lawyers. And one of those lawyers was actually Pablo Fajardo, who worked directly on the Chevron case. And there were lawyers from all around the world, 12 of them. And the definition that they came up with was so concise and clear that it's really, made a difference to how real people feel this possibility to be. And if you'll permit me, I'm actually going to do this. Hold on. It's so concise, it fits on the back of a card.
Oh, look at that. Well, can you read
so
it to us very slowly so we really kind of hear every word?
I will do. It's very compact, so that's not difficult. So ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And it's such a short definition. And there's a further paragraph that explains what each of those terms could mean, like widespread, long-term, etc. But it allows people to really grasp this in the political world. And of course, as with any kind of legal definition, there are lawyers out there who was like, well, that's not radical enough, or that's to this, or that's to the. But actually, when it's been presented to politicians, it's been very well received. And that's really important, because what it shows is that process of drafting that those lawyers underwent emerged with something that seems to have hit a kind of a sweet spot, because it's both preventive for the worst harms, but it also takes into account existing laws, because it talks about unlawful or wanton, because laws are different in different countries. Ecuador, for example, has the rights of nature in its constitution, but many countries do not. There are more joining all the time. Panama's just passed something just in the last week, I believe, that includes rights of nature. So that's really exciting. But bodies of law are different in different places. And so if this law is to be accepted by governments, which it needs to be in order to join that list of international crimes, then it needs to acknowledge existing law. But then it also has this word wanton in it, which means that even if what you're doing is permitted, if the destruction that you're going to cause is disproportionate and severe, then potentially you are also falling foul of this law. So it has that kind of flexibility built into it. But it also has a kind of, the way that it's phrased is it works in a preventive way. It's a crime of endangerment. So just like as a war crime, if you direct an attack at a civilian population, that's a crime, even if the population itself isn't harmed. So the directing of the attack is the crime. In the same way, the way this definition is phrased means that if the act that you're undertaking it creates the substantial likelihood of that severe harm, then that is the crime. And that's so important, because what we're trying to do here is it's not only about, justice in the cases where damage has happened. It's actually about changing behavior and preventing future harm. Because what you want is those decision makers to be sitting there thinking, if I sign on this dotted line, am I going to be creating this potential of really severe harm? And therefore having to think very carefully about, what projects they support. And also, of course, that then helps as a framework for policymakers to be thinking, well, where should our support be going? Where should the subsidies be going? What direction should we be moving in, given that this law is approaching, so that we don't fall foul of this. So a lot of this, the power of this is actually in people becoming aware of it. And that's why it's so exciting being on your podcast, because the more people understand this and the more people can see this law coming, and the more that conversation grows, the more the people making those decisions on those projects, whether that's the CEOs, whether that's the financiers, whether that's the insurers, whether that's the government ministers, they're all going to think, right, okay, this is coming down the line, so we need to think now about what direction we need to go in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what we need to kind of get it through into these kind of upper echelons that seem to be making all these decisions on our behalf, and they just pay a little fine, and which is, is pence for them. It really, like you said before, they kind of take into account that there may well be some little accidents along the way. But this premise, which is, the base stone of this, do no harm.
Mm.
And when we can see that, for, ourselves as individuals, what does that mean to do no harm? And as we move that up and we're looking at governments and banks and all these institutions, it's changing away their kind of the definition of who they are, because often they just don't take that into consideration. And the law of Ecocide will really help push that into the front. I think that everybody would agree that, yes, wouldn't it be nice if we lived in a world where we did no harm? And that's where really ultimately, where we want to go.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. There is this aspect that when your personal freedom is at stake, when it's a criminal aspect to it, then, that kind of really kind of concentrates the mind, because, no corporate actor or indeed government minister wants to be, in the same dock as a war criminal. That's just not how, that it. And actually the corporate world in particular, the reputation of, not just the person in question, but the whole business that they're involved in is also going to be strongly affected. So there's a way in which Ecocide as a deterrent could be really, really powerful. And what we're seeing now is, and it's interesting because, Polly worked for this for, the last decade of her life, specifically on this idea of Ecocide as a crime. And the irony is that actually, since she's passed away, it's really kind of taken wing. And I think that this is one of these sort of slightly tragic things that sometimes happens when you have a really strong figurehead for an initiative. People have a little bit of a tendency to sit back and say, well, I don't need to do that because she's doing it, or I don't need to do that because he's doing it, and so there was this crazy moment when Polly had this really rapid cancer, and she departed very quickly within a few weeks, and it was extraordinary and shocking. And at the time, a lot of people that had been following her were kind of, what's going to happen to this work? If she dies, we don't want to, will it die with her? And of course, actually what happened was completely the opposite, because suddenly, as her closest associate, I suddenly had people getting in touch saying, well, how can we help you make this happen? We cannot let this work die with her. And what was amazing to find was that there were so many other people, campaigners like yourself, but also politicians, lawyers, groups in other countries, who were already often inspired by Polly, but who were already working on Ecocide and wanting to move this forward. And they all started to get in touch. And so it's almost like the last sort of, 3 to 4 years has been this sort of great big dot joining exercise, of kind of connecting all of these people who are, who are interested in this. And actually, ultimately, what we're emerging with is a kind of a global movement, which is hugely exciting. And it's also been, I think, strongly supported by the fact that we've seen some really major climate mobilizations. I don't think we can deny that, and I think we should absolutely acknowledge that Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, Stop the Manganese, all these different on the ground movements have created a level of sort of disruption, if you like, in the media and political conversation, which has allowed this legal initiative to really land in the space. Because a few years ago, people were saying to us, that's it sounds a bit extreme, it's a bit drastic, isn't it, the idea of criminalizing serious harm to nature. I mean, obviously to us it felt like a no-brainer, but at the same time, it was seen as a bit left field or a bit, extreme. Now it's actually starting to look very much like the common sense we've always believed it was. It's been a very interesting journey over the last couple of years with that, in that respect.
It's funny though, because common sense is not common though, is it? And so somebody said, it really helped me, when we were all grieving so much for the loss of Polly as a person, for her work, for so much. And somebody said to me, but it's like when a mighty tree falls and all of a sudden, all the light is let into the forest. And so all these saplings can then come up. And for me, it was such a great analogy.
That's a lovely metaphor
of what had happened, exactly. And it felt like, yes, so there being no Polly, there was all this space, exactly like you said, for all of us that were interested to step in and say, well, okay, how can I be a part of this jigsaw? How all these threads can be woven together. And, and I was so excited when I heard about Pablo Fajardo being brought into the new definition, because I thought, gosh, back in 2015, when Polly and myself were on stage in conversation about Ecocide, and she was speaking about her hero, Pablo Fajardo, and she wanted to know about him because of my work with him. So we had this great conversation with Pablo, and and I'm sure she's smiling down thinking, yes, to have him helping with that definition was perfect. So yes, seeing how it's all kind of weaving together. But tell us a little bit about what countries have been involved.
Yeah, so wow, I mean, it's been extraordinary actually, because the first country to really bring it onto the international stage again, having really after sort of 50 years silence on that count, was a small island state called Vanuatu. We like to actually call them the Great Ocean States, because actually they're the Great Ocean States of the Pacific. And Vanuatu was the first nation to call for ecocide to be seriously considered at the International Criminal Court, and that was in 2019. And that was like a seed. It was like sort of putting the conversation back on the international governmental level, if you like. It was a real kind of important seeding there. And then the following year, President Macron of France expressed support for it, and others began to engage in that conversation. By the time we got to December of 2020, Belgium was also supporting with that conversation at the ICC in their official statements. And then when and it was at that time that we convened the panel to draw up the legal definition. And this is really interesting because, of course, there had been working definitions in the past, including one of Polly's that we used for many years. But this was different because what was happening was that the political appetite was growing. So in fact, in the summer of 2020, it was some Swedish parliamentarians that approached us and said, obviously this is your area of expertise, would you be able to convene, to commission a definition that could be, that would have the sort of practicality and credibility that we could take it to our government potentially and say, would you be able to propose this? Would you be interested to propose this at the ICC? So there was that that drafting group was convened precisely as a result of that political appetite growing. And in turn, that helped, obviously to create huge traction politically when that definition emerged. And so that now we're actually looking at a situation where not just those 2 or 3, but 19 of the member states of the International Criminal Court have now got on public record discussion of criminalizing ecocide in various ways. And that can go from Belgium. So Belgium, before Christmas last year, had a vote in their parliament where it was really, it was overwhelming majority in favor of Belgium legislating for ecocide and supporting it internationally. And at the International Criminal Courts Assembly, we presented the definition to the Assembly. Of course, that was where it was destined for. But that was with the support of 3, not 1, but 3 climate vulnerable states. So Vanuatu, Samoa, and Bangladesh officially co-hosted that presentation, and Belgium made a diplomatic intervention as part of that, and Finland also supported it in their statement to the ICC. So it just gives you a bit of a broad flavour, but there are now a lot of countries where this is being seriously spoken about. And just this weekend, this week is the UN Environment Assembly, and they had their youth section over the weekend just gone, and the paper that is emerging from that session is also calling for ecocide crime. So it's starting to emerge at the sort of highest level now of the UN conferences and international state discussion.
Great. So for us to actually change the Rome Statute and to have the law of ecocide put into its rightful place, I mean, how many countries actually need to sign up to this?
So in order to actually adopt it, it requires two-thirds of the member states of the ICC. But in order to put it on the table, to put the proposal on the table, which is what starts that conversation, you only need to have 1 state. I mean, in reality, it's likely to be a group of states, because most countries would feel quite nervous about being on their own to propose something new like this. But there are a number of the Pacific Island states that are potentially interested in continuing this conversation. Whether they yet have the courage to combine to put that proposal forward, we don't know, but it could be as early as this year. I mean, of course, none of this can be exactly predicted when you're dealing with international diplomacy. And of course, it's not in our hands, it's in the hands of the states themselves to move that forward. But we do our best to help to facilitate and convene and encourage and so on. But yeah, so you only need a state or a small group of states to make that proposal, which puts the conversation on the table. Discussions can then take some time. Now, the last crime to be added to the Rome Statute, which is the governing document for the for international crimes, the last crime to be added was the crime of aggression, and that took I think between 7 and 10 years in terms of its negotiation and discussion between states. Now, actually, we suspect that this will take quite a bit quicker. This will actually happen faster because the climate is different, literally, of course, but also politically. There is a far greater sense of urgency. I mean, the IPCC report, international report that came out yesterday, talking about the impacts of climate change, just shows how urgent it is that action is taken. And so we anticipate that this law could be being ratified between 3 and 5 years, which for a change in international law could be really quite fast. And of course, some people are sort of saying, well, we need this now, we need this yesterday. How can you say that it's going to take, 3 to 5 years? But actually, what people often don't realize is that space of time is really hugely important for one of the reasons I was mentioning earlier, which is that when the key sort of corporate and political actors can see something coming, that's when the strategies and the approaches start to change. So actually that, between, now and expanding that conversation and say 4 to 5 years time when the law could be being ratified, that is the space of time in which the thinking and the change is really going to start to happen, because no, this is not a retroactive thing. It's not like when you put ecocide law in place, suddenly everyone that's ever committed ecocide is a criminal. It doesn't work like that. So the idea is that it will come into play when it comes into play, but being able to see that that's going to happen enables the corporate world to actually adapt and move in the direction that it needs to move, so that we can't afford to make enemies of anyone, really, because the whole world has to move with this. So the important thing is for them to see this as a necessary parameter, an essential one, and of course it is inevitable. Sooner or later this is coming, and of course our job is just making it sooner.
Absolutely. There's I remember Polly explaining it once, saying that when we're looking at, Shell, for instance, or one of the oil companies, it kind of gives them time to realize, well, actually, are you going to just shift your business because you're not going to want to be, criminalized? So it's kind of inevitable, we would think that they would move into the clean forms of power. I mean, they have been scratching at the surface, but most oil companies, it's been token the amount of solar and wind that they have been supporting. But it's kind of inevitable that in the future they have a lot of infrastructure to actually be doing that. So maybe you could also just talk quickly about what kind of crimes would, what kind of things apart from the oil industry would be classed as an ecocide?
This is always a tricky one in terms of, we often get asked, what's the exact line, and, where exactly will this fall? Now, we tend to think of ecocide as more like almost like a health and safety law for the planet. So you're not going to be thinking, the thing is with environmental regulation at the moment, it's mostly along the lines of, well, you can release this amount of this toxin in this context, but only up to this much before it becomes, so it's very prescriptive and detailed. What we're looking at with more of a sort of health and safety concept is, instead of trying to sort of mitigate risks, you're actually looking at avoiding hazards. So in the same way as you wouldn't set up your factory to, almost allow people to be killed falling off things, but not quite, you would actually just make sure that they didn't fall off anything. So effectively what we're looking at is the kinds of things that would go beyond that safety rail, effectively. So and of course we're aiming for an international law, because we're aiming for that impact and that messaging and that sort of overall framework within which people need to work. So for ecocide specifically as an international crime, it would need to be something quite big. And of course the Chevron case in Ecuador, I would be absolutely staggered if that wasn't a very obvious case. If you look at the definition in more detail, it looks at the harm has to be severe. So it can't just be chopping down the trees on your village green, because it's got to be at the level of an international crime. So it's got to be severe, and either widespread or long term under this definition. And I think that that's actually a nice way to balance it, because there may be aspects where something could might not be long term in the sense that it could remedy over a few years, but it might be devastating across a wide area in the immediate. So that would be under widespread. Otherwise, long term, you could have something that's quite geographically restricted, but horrifically toxic and irreversible, in which case you've got something that's long term. So you could be talking about for example mass deforestation. You could be talking about oil spills. You could be talking about, for example, industrial disasters that could have been prevented. So, for example, we know that with Deepwater Horizon, we know that with Fukushima, there were elements that were either suggested in design or that were safety protocols that weren't followed. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine that with a law like this in place, all of that would have been paid far more attention to, and you'd obviously have a wildly lower chance of there being serious accidents. But also you could be looking at any activities which at their extreme really destroy ecosystems. So for example, potentially certain kinds of industrial fishing, and even
the fashion industry. I'm getting an image of, I just heard recently that you can tell the next season's fashion by what color the river is flowing in China. It's like, really, to think that we have such, major contamination happening from the fashion industry, that you can actually change the color of a river.
It's absolutely insane. I think you're absolutely right. And I think the fashion industry, but I think also industrial agriculture will really have to think carefully about the practices, because
I think joining the dots together as well. And so much of the kind of environmental contamination and activists is still very siloed, but when we start joining up, I mean, there's a really good example is with the plastics. And there's a big kind of momentum going to look at plastics, look at recycling, look at the state of the oceans. But quite often people forget that plastics come, first of all, from oil, gas, and coal. So you have the original kind of exploitation of fossil fuels. Then you have the processing plants, which are processing all these fossil fuels into plastics, which have massive health effects on the people that live on the front line of these kind of plants. Then you have it shipped to the supermarkets, which then create these mountains and mountains of rubbish. Then it ends up in the ocean, contaminating the marine environment. And this kind of circle of harm which fossil fuels cause, I think the more that we can link all these up together. So if you're somebody that's protesting against plastic, well then same for getting in board with those that are helping raise awareness about fracking and oil and gas, because it's all exactly the same roots.
It's all connected, and I think that that's what's so important about the whole Ecocide initiative, is that it is all encompassing, and particularly with this incredibly elegant definition, effectively you're looking at any kind of threat of severe harm to any aspect of the environment. And actually, the thing is, we have to acknowledge that, just having this number of people that we have existing on the planet, we create an impact on the environment. What we're not doing is using our unique, and it really is unique, creative imagination as human beings. This is what I think really is so unique about humanity, is that we have this incredible creativity, we have this incredible imagination, and we're not employing it in the right direction. And so there's something about having this kind of overall parameter that basically says this much harm thou shalt not do, kind of thing, going back to what you said about first do no harm, that actually then it's almost like if we use that as a lens to actually look at all the activities, then we then we actually start to see where we can't go, and therefore where we need to go. And of course, any entrepreneur, and indeed any artist, come to think of it, if you have clear parameters, that's what really unleashes the creativity. So knowing exactly where you can't go gives you a lot more impetus to actually develop the ways that you actually need to go. Because I refuse to believe that our species is not capable of imagining and realizing a future that can work in harmony with the natural world. I am absolutely certain that we're able to do that. But it's a little bit like, in the meantime, what we seem to be doing is a little bit like kind of mopping the floor while the tap's still running. You've actually got to turn off that tap. And that tap you could think of as like all the funding and the policy going towards those old destructive habits. You've got to turn off that tap before you can properly, get that floor clean and start doing something different. There's a bit of a houseworky sort of metaphor, but it's a nice straightforward one.
I was just interviewing Ralph Sharmi from the IMF, who also started Rebalance Earth, and he came up with a very similar metaphor when we were talking about valuing natural ecosystem services. He said, think of the bathtub and the tap. He said, you've got to turn the tap off, which is all the fossil fuels, but still the bathtub is overflowing. As well as turning the tap off, we've also got to drain the bathtub. And that is where nature comes in. If we let nature do its bit, it can sequester vast amounts of carbon. But it's us being able to work with nature and, and learning from nature, not just learning about it, which is where we've been trapped for so long. It's just, we want to know the scientific name. We want to, we know all about it, but actually learning from it and being able to visualize a future is what is so vital. I think many people, they can't see the future. They haven't been able to see that another world is possible. So we kind of get trapped in this apocalyptic worldview.
Absolutely. And I think it's a worldview that's developed over an awfully long time. You know, I mean, in the Western canon, which is, you know, the sort of modes of thinking that dominate the global structures at the moment, you know, come from this incredibly dualistic tradition, which sort of separates spirit from body, it separates male from female, it separates reason from, you know, from emotion, you know, so we have this way of separating ourselves from nature in that same way. And so it's almost like the current system is the logical conclusion of that way of thinking. And there's something, again, I think that's interesting about ecocide law here, because if you put ecocide alongside genocide, so if you put destruction of nature alongside destruction of people, what you're saying is actually quite profound, because what you're saying is it matters just as much that we don't, you know, that we protect the living systems around us, you
and
know, as it is that
we aren't separate, because there's
exactly
humans are separate to nature, and we're talking about a law for nature and a law to protect nature, and it's like, actually we have to remember that we are just like a mosquito or a worm, or we are another species living on this planet, you know, no greater or lesser. I mean, I recently learned that we have 1,000 different species of bacteria living in our belly buttons, and we need them. Without
amazing.
all the life form that lives on us and in us, we are like little mini earths ourselves. So when we're talking about protecting nature, we are also talking about protecting ourselves.
Exactly. I think that's absolutely it. That's absolutely it. And so when you actually sort of put those things sort of next to each other, you start realizing that actually there isn't this separation, that actually, and also, of course, you know, and even if you want to take it purely from a point of view of sort of, you know, Homo sapiens self-interest, you know, we can't survive without, you know, healthy ecosystems anyway. I mean, you know, what are we going to breathe? What are we going to drink? What are we going to eat? I mean,
so it might seem that, you know, this kind of law of ecocide is kind of ahead of itself, but, you know, its time is now. And many people, when we look through history and we look at apartheid, we look at the end of slavery, we look at women's rights, you know, it's like all of these rights-based campaigns, they struggled for so long that, you know, now we take it for granted. But when we think of those people that were on the front line, you know, struggling to make these laws a reality, and then it happens and it just becomes the way that it is. And the next rights issue is nature's rights. So the law of ecocide is like in this perfect position to help move us into that next reality. So it is very exciting times.
I love the way you said that, because that's how we think of it. It's like a kind of a bridging piece, you know, that can actually take us forward into a different way of operating.
The ecological age, maybe, we're ready for.
Well, I certainly hope so.
Yes, I think we both do. Well, thank you so much, Jojo, for your time and for your work. And, you know, so I hope all the people that haven't already heard about ecocide understand it and its importance, and please, you know, talk to other people, look into it a bit more. There's lots more information on the sites as well, so you can look on Stop Ecocide. And so I will put the links in as well to the chat, and
wonderful.
We all look forward to that day when we can celebrate that the time has come, and it's got its place alongside genocide, and ecocide has the place that it needs to be for all of us, for all life. So once again, thank you. And until we're next looking at each other.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here.
Bye.
Bye-bye for now.